Well, welcome to you all to the first event of our Bridgewater area One Book, One Community. My name is Ellen Snowenbus, and I'm kind of the chair of the committee, but it's a group effort, believe me, of all the members of the committee. We have a number of events that are coming up. This is the first one we're very excited about, and we've got 4 book discussions planned. Tomorrow night in West Bridgewater, and then in April 15th in Bridgewater Library, April 16th Bridgewater Senior Center, and then April 22nd at East Bridgewater. They have a great discussion. And then of course on May 8th we're planning a bus trip down to Newport, because the books we focused on this year are The Lost Summers of Newport, which was a collectively written book by 3 best-selling authors. And then also the nonfiction book choice was The Vanderbilts by Anderson Cooper, which was the opposite of dry. It was so interesting. Just because it's nonfiction doesn't mean it just doesn't grab you and hold you. So I highly recommend both books. But as usual, you don't have to have read either book to enjoy the events. We're happy to have you come to the lecture. We're happy to have you come to the bus trip, even the discussion groups. So to introduce this event, our fearless leader in terms of finding, we always used to ask, well, Gloria, find us a speaker. And Gloria Moran always does.
Thank you. I have to tell you, Brian and I were at an event at the university. Burnell School is now going to be the center for elementary and secondary education. And we were talking about getting a speaker. Guess who happened to be walking across? People at the university are really nervous when they see me coming. Come on down, we need you. So it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Brian Payne, who I found out years ago was a neighbor of Cindy and Hank Boudreau's when he lived in Bridgewater. He is in the history department. Dr. Payne is also the acting dean of the Humanities and Social Science Department. And when I told him that we were talking about the Gilded Age, he said, that is my area. I said, you are it. So without further
no backing out at that point.
no backing out. So without further ado, I would like to introduce and welcome Dr. Brian Payne.
My best not to disappoint. I'm currently serving as the interim dean in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I've been doing that since August 1st. Before that, I was actually on a research sabbatical, so I haven't actually taught a class in over a year, and so this is super nervous. I used to do this every day, day in and day out for decades, and I forgot how nerve-wracking it is to stand in front of people who expect you to know something. I taught in history. I'm an economic historian. I specialize on resource economics and poverty policy. And I teach classes on the history of capitalism in early America, which goes from a little bit before the American Revolution up through what we call the Jacksonian era. I also teach courses on the Gilded Age and the Industrial Revolution. And my real main area of focus is the Great Depression and the New Deal. And within all 3 of those, I really focus on wealth accumulation, the wealth debate, and questions of poverty and poverty relief. And since you're going to go see, and you're reading Vanderbilt, it seems pretty appropriate to talk about the accumulation of economic power during the Gilded Age and the concentration of that power in the inevitable wealth inequality that it created. The Gilded Age, if it's known for anything, is known for a rapid increase in wealth distribution or wealth inequality between the upper 1% and the other 90%, which is typically the ratio economic historians tend to look at. And so I'm going to start by giving you just a little bit of background on the Industrial Revolution. I'll try to move through this pretty quickly, because I'm sure most of you kind of know this stuff already. Before we get into the real meat of what I want to talk about is that philosophical debate about whether wealth inequality existed If it did exist, was there something problematic about it? Is that just a bad thing? And if it is a bad thing, what strategies might have been taken to address that wealth inequality? And really speaking specifically from a political philosophy perspective, was voiced by the reformers and the critics of the time in the late 19th and early 20th century. So to start with, if there's one thing you need to know in terms of historical context about the Gilded Age, is the rapid rise in production. Nearly everything that the United States made increases fantastically during the Gilded Age. Production rates are in the 1, 2, 5, 6, or even 1,000% times over in terms of the American productive capacity in the decades following the American Civil War. And whether that came from just the introduction of new products, we have a plethora of new products coming onto the marketplace, whether it comes from new technologies that were introduced to improve the efficiency of production of previous products, or new business strategies that were used to increase the efficiency of economic development, we see enormous increases in the productive capacity of the American economy after the American Civil War. This productive capacity required a consolidation of resources, wealth, knowledge, experience, machinery, infrastructure, transportation, in a way that we really hadn't seen before the American Civil War. So we also see a concentration of economic productivity, where fewer and bigger companies were taking over larger and larger percentile shares of any one enterprise within the economy, the rise of big corporations. With that concentration of economic power in combination to the increase of productivity, we therefore see an increased production of wealth and an increased concentration of wealth within smaller but bigger corporate entities. That's not to say that wealth inequality didn't exist before the American Civil War. I wouldn't make that argument. There were poor people before the Civil War. There were rich people before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, we see the gap between rich and poor increase significantly during the Gilded Age period. That's also particularly true when you break things down to just white men, right? So obviously slavery, the inequalities of gender, tends to upset that equation. But if you evaluate the place of white men in American society before the Civil War, there was typically more opportunity for the average American white male to move upward economically than we see after the American Civil War. That was one element of the story, the economic part of it. The other issue at play is the political structure. The American political structure before and after the Civil War was rooted on a fairly basic concept of republicanism. I know a lot of times we talk about American democracy, but the concept of democracy is pretty immature. We really don't see Americans embracing the concept of democracy until the 1820s, and even then it was a pretty radical idea. This idea that there should be a democratic system to the American political structure. It's really not until really the 1930s that we see a wholesale embracement of the concept of democracy. Before that, Americans' political system was rooted in a republic, the concept of a republic. The Founding Fathers had a fairly basic interpretation of what a republic was. In terms of the talk today, what mattered most to them was the concept of the Commonwealth, right? The Commonwealth. We live in a Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There are 4 Commonwealths in the United States. Do you know what the 4 states are that are Commonwealths? Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, Kentucky.
Oh.
Kentucky is the 4th Commonwealth. Kentucky was really just an expansion of Virginia. Kentucky was Virginian territory before the American Revolution, was carved off as an independent state following the American Revolution. And so if we look at, basically, it's Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania are the original Commonwealths. Those are the 3 hotbed areas of the American Revolution, right? Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Massachusetts. Those were the radicals that drove the American Revolution. And it's not by accident that those are commonwealths, where the other states are states. those three places, the political thinkers that resided in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Massachusetts were very much embedded in the concept of what is a commonwealth. For them, the American Republic would succeed only if those in charge of the political systems believed in the value of a commonwealth, the common well-being of the community, the wealth of the common. It was very much dedicated to community well-being. And the philosophy was that any individual would sacrifice individual wants or needs should those individual wants and needs would come into conflict with the well-being of the collective, the common good, the commonwealth. So we talk about liberty, we talk about equality as these big words that we build our social structure and our identities around. In the 1790s, the Commonwealth would be one of those big ideas. The well-being of the collective was central to the values of a republic. A republic only works if the individuals in charge were willing to sacrifice individual needs and wants when they came into conflict with the collective well-being. That was the concept of good citizenship. Now, citizenship was defined pretty narrowly, right? There weren't many people who were allowed to be citizens of the republic, and they were identified as those individuals who had the capacity to sacrifice their individual wants and needs for the collective well-being. And so, being biased based on race and gender, that typically meant property-owning white men were in the had a financial independence that would allow them to do this. Let me put it a different way. If you're already a rich landowner, you could sacrifice a couple extra dollars of profit if it meant the betterment of the collective. Now, we can disagree with that philosophy all we want today. But this is where Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington were coming from, right? They were very much embedded in this concept of citizenry within the collective well-being. Okay, so we can debate whether or not that is a bunch of garbage or not, but let's just assume for the moment that it's a decent political system, right? Enter capitalism. Now, capitalism in its early idealization in the 1790s into the first decades of the 19th century was pretty simplistically defined as an economic growth independent of government or state oversight. But from a philosophical perspective, what capitalism does, it empowers the individual. Capitalism allows an individual to seek profit for individual gain, free of the confines of the state, free of the confines of the collective well-being, free of the confines of a commonwealth. So early political philosophical debate saw a conflict between a republic, a political system that was rooted in collective well-being, and capitalism, an economic system that empowered the individual. One is individualistic, one is collective. So these early political philosophers of the early 1800s were wrestling with this concept. How do we reconcile the liberation from mercantilism, the previous economic system, and the creation of capitalism? How do we reconcile the individualism of capitalism with the collectivism of a republic? Their initial effort at that had to do with the creation of democracy in the 1820s. For them, democracy was a political version of capitalism in that it empowers the individual. What made democracy different than a republic in 1800 time period is that democracy justified an individual from operating as a political entity from the basis of their individual desires. Every person gets an equal say, right? So democracy seeks the well-being of the collective via the interests of the individual, whereas a republic seeks the well-being of the individual from the interest of the collective. Now, as I mentioned to start with, democracy kind of was introduced in the 1820s, but it really wasn't manifested. If you look at political speeches through the antebellum period of famous men running for political office, they don't champion democracy, they champion republic. Keep going back to republic. What's the biggest political party to materialize in the antebellum period? The Republican Party, in contrast to the Democratic Party. That's because one understood the future of the nation as being democratic, one understood the future of the nation being republic. That's a different story. Let's get back to this concept of wealth. So by the Gilded Age, by we'll say 1877, that's the end of Reconstruction, beginning of the Gilded Age. So for simplicity reasons, we'll say 1877. There's this re-emergence of this debate. How do we reconcile the ideas of a republic, because the Civil War proved that the republic was the answer. They won the Civil War, Republican Party. So the republic was the future. How do we reconcile the collectivism of a republic with the individualism of wealth accumulation that they're now seeing at a massive level in the 1877 to 1900 period? Massive amounts of wealth, right? These are the captains of industry, the robber barons, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans. These individuals are accumulating wealth at rates unimaginable to Americans before this time period. The concept of America as a small agrarian republic seems to be falling apart. And the emergence of massive industrial America with big captains of industry who are lighting their cigars with $100 bills, these fat cats of capitalism. How do you reconcile that massive amount of economic wealth in the individual with the collectivism of a republic? Can you have wealth and equality in a republic? A political system that's rooted in the basic belief that all people need to sacrifice individualism for the collective well-being. Can you have wealth and equality in a republic? If one person can get really rich while others remain really poor, is that antithetical to the American Republican ideal? And even if capitalism does work and all boats do rise in a tide, is it okay to have massive amounts of wealth and equality even if you don't have poverty? Which is a nice debate I have with my students. Let's pretend we have a world in where there's no such thing as poverty, but we also have massive amounts of wealth and equality. Is that okay? Is that okay for the American Republic to exist? So this is the debate that people begin to have in the post-Civil War period. Between 1877 and 1900 or so, most of society, government, the legal system in particular, tended to bias the individual of capitalism over the collective well-being of the republic. And it's in this time period where we start to really see the celebration of that concept of liberty. The concept of individual liberty starts to appear much more frequently in the political philosophy of American society than, say, commonwealth. And we start to see the decreasing emphasis on a commonwealth idea in this period. The first effort to do this, we can back up a little bit, is something called the American system. I'll fast forward through this pretty quickly. Anybody hear the American system before in their 8th grade history class, maybe? Okay. The American system is it's a label we apply to history. It's not like people were walking around in the 1820s and 30s saying, hey, we live in the American system. It's something we've applied as historians to try to wrap our minds around what's going on. The American system is a term we use, economic historians use, to discuss the economic system that emerged as a result of the American Civil War, the breakdown of mercantilism. You guys know what mercantilism? That ring a bell? So that's the colonial state, and where the economy before the American Revolution, the American economy before the Revolution was highly regulated by the British Empire. Highly regulated, highly controlled, with very little individual liberty available in that economic system. The American system tries to flip that upside down and try to balance individualism of capitalism with the collective well-being of the Commonwealth by liberating individuals to seek individual profit. The free corporate movement, there's the charter movement, there's lots of judicial Supreme Court decisions that are made in the early decades of the 19th century that liberate an individual's ability to speculate on marketplaces. I spend like an entire week here in my classes, but I just want to quickly go through 2 exemptions to the rule, because we do actually see a lot of government regulation in this time period. One is in the form of tariffs, and one is a form of what we call internal improvements. We all know what tariffs are, especially now, right? What's the purpose of a tariff? Why would the government pass a law to create a tariff? What's the purpose of a tariff?
Restrict things.
Restrict what?
External
Goods and services.
Yeah, from where?
Elsewhere.
Elsewhere, imported goods, right? Technically, it's a tax on an imported good. We throw a tax, a bounty, a port charge, however you want to do it. Why would we do that? Why would the government put a tax on imported foreign goods? What's the purpose?
Made USA.
To favor American-made products. In the early 1800s, the main purpose of a tariff was to raise government revenue. It was really the only way the federal government could raise revenue, because the federal government doesn't have income tax power yet. They can't lodge income tax on the federal government. The only other way the federal government can make money is to sell land in the American West, but that's not really generating a lot of money. So for the American system, the tariff was really there to raise government revenue, to pay off the Revolutionary War debt. That was the only reason. It was purely a way to make money. But you're right, the main premise of a tariff is consumer manipulation, to artificially increase the cost of foreign-made goods to encourage consumers to purchase domestic-made goods. It's hardly free market capitalism, right? It's a manipulation of the economy by the government to change consumer spending habits. The other example is internal improvements. What that means is the government, now this was more at the state level than the federal level, spent a lot of money to create highways, canals, some of the early railroads. The idea there was to improve internal commerce, to get Virginia to trade with Kentucky, to get Ohio to trade with New York, to create an internal economic system to move goods around. So early canals, early turnpikes, some of the earliest railroads were all government funded. 100%. These are not private ventures. These are government funded entities. Normally at the state level, not the federal level, but normally at the state level. The most famous one is the exception. The Erie Canal was largely a privately funded operation with some help from the state of New York. But for the most part, canals and turnpikes and early railroads were government funded. So it wasn't totally free market capitalism, but it's an early effort to try to make free market capitalism work. Now here in my classes, I then turn my attention to talk about New England textile mills and the railroad economy in the American Northeast. I'm not going to do that tonight, but the lesson plan here is try to get the students to understand how the United States, Americans redefined what it was to be a, quote, corporation. Prior to the American Revolution, a corporate charter, so INC period, incorporated, was handed out on a case-by-case basis by the government. The government would issue a group of people a corporate charter. They would only issue a corporate charter if that individual could prove 2 things. 1, the business venture was highly speculative, which may or may not succeed, highly likely to fail. And 2, was in the best interest of the Commonwealth. It had to be something that was going to help everybody in society. So things like hospitals, schools, transportation systems, bridges were incorporated. But as we move through the 1820s, there's something called a free corporate movement, which breaks down the barriers and allows pretty much anybody to get a corporate charter for pretty much anything that they want to do. Corporate charters provide 2 real benefits in 19th century terms. One, it creates limited liability. You know what what's limited liability?
can't lose your house because your company did something stupid.
Exactly. So that it can't lose your house because your company did something stupid, and it also provides a monopoly. In 19th century terms, corporate charters also provided you a legalized monopoly. If I gave you a corporate charter to build a bridge across a river, the government would not then give the next person a corporate charter. So building this bridge across a river was a highly speculative venture. The bridge might fall down and lots of people die, you're not going to lose your house. But it may or may not make you any money. And if it does make you money, it's going to make you money 10 years. So that monopoly was central to your economic viability. So it was a common good, and it was highly speculative. But in the 1820s, there's this movement to just break down the paperwork, cut the red tape, and allow corporate charters. So railroads and textile mills were some of the first to successfully receive corporate charters by just filing basic paperwork. What this does is it increases speculation. We want to actually encourage economic speculation in the 19th century. Another example I would talk about is bankruptcy law, which my students always love, spending a tremendous amount of time diving through bankruptcy law. I joke with them, I'm an economic historian, which is the two boringest disciplines combined together. I could just get philosophy in there. So the idea throughout the early 19th century is to break down the barriers of speculation, to get people willing to try things and to gamble things and not pay the penalty. So the simple thing is like eliminating imprisonment for bankruptcy. Something as simple as that. Say, well, you know what? Maybe I will try a textile firm. What the hell? Okay, they can't take my house if things burn down. Maybe I'll get a monopoly, for at least a local monopoly in Lowell. And if it goes bust, I'll just try something else. And so it just creates this speculative mania. Banks are another important part of the free bank movement. We spend a week on that. About like the paper money debate. Like we all kind of come to accept that we have a US money, but that's a very new thing. You know, if you rewind to 1820, you could have 8 different types of bank currency in your wallet at any given time. Right? You could have a local bank, you could have a state bank. There weren't really any federal notes. That doesn't really happen until the Treasury, which is 1916. US Treasury is 1916. It's the first time we have a U.S. currency. Before that there would be a Bridgewater currency, right? There'd be a Brockton currency. There'd be maybe Massachusetts currency. Some would be private, some would be public, some were total garbage, some were valuable. There's all kinds of fake money out there. Counterfeiting is all over the place. So there's lots of economic speculation going on in the 19th century, which creates a very chaotic economy. There's a recession or a depression like every 5 days. Most of them are localized. There'd be a depression in Bridgewater, maybe Massachusetts, maybe the Northeast. There aren't a ton of big national depression. There are a few big ones, but the economies were still a little too localized. All right, so where am I? I'm going to skip all that. Okay. Here I also talk about the consumer economy. I'm going to sort of not talk about that at all, but we do see the rise, a gradual shift to where the American economy is starting to make a little bit more money off of consumer goods rather than production goods. So before about 1870, it was like, infrastructure development, iron, eventually steel, railroads, canal. By about 1900, we start to see like sewing machines, washing machines, these more consumer-oriented goods start to become a bigger share of the overall growth of the American economy. Things like Montgomery Ward, Sears, A&P, these start to become big players in the economy. I then shift my attention, this is like the third day, by the way, of the lecture, to industrial organizations, vertical and horizontal integration. I'm not going to this is super boring, but I have a really cool diagram I draw on the whiteboard about this one, about like vertical integration is where one company seeks to take control of the production of a product from beginning to end. So try not to get this mixed up here. That I think I used Carnegie as the example. Is that right? You were in the class. Carnegie is a good example of vertical integration. When he tried to take control of steel production from the very beginning, pulling the iron ore out of the ground, to owning every step of the production until you get the railroad tie. And including transportational infrastructure to move raw materials back and forth. He got so obsessed with this, he would actually buy like the mountain that they were mining the iron ore out of, right? Wow. So he wanted total control of the production of one good. Horizontal integration is where you take control of every competitor on one step of the production. So Rockefeller is the textbook example of this. He was interested in oil, right? Rockefeller oil. But initially he was only interested in the refining of crude oil into usable petroleum. And so his real big venture was to control all the refineries on a horizontal line, whereas Carnegie is trying to control every step of the production of steel. There might be other competitors, but he wanted total control of the production of steel. Rockefeller wanted to eliminate all the competitors on one stage of the production line. And there's reasons why each of them approached it from those angles. If you really want to know, I can talk about that later. There's a dry erase board, so I can draw that.
That's okay.
You're good? All right.
We're good.
What happens, what do you get when you have both vertical and horizontal integration?
Monopoly.
Monopoly, yes. See? Better than my students. You have a monopoly. And eventually both Rockefeller and Carnegie both do that. They both integrate horizontally and vertically to create a monopoly. Rockefeller had something like 90% of the control of the US oil industry. Carnegie had an equal amount of the control of the steel industry. Oh yeah, it's up there. John D. Rockefeller did this via a system known as trusts. You've all heard of trust, antitrust, but let me give you a little bit of historical background to what a trust is. A trust is an ancient legal system. It goes all the way back to medieval England, and where the courts could provide an individual the trust of another individual. Think trust fund baby or something like that, where the court decide that one individual is not competent enough to protect their own interest. They give this other person legal control to do that in their trust. That we trust you to manage their resources in their best interest, a trust. All right, so it was typically applied to widows because women can't control their finances. That's medieval England talking. My wife does all of our finances. I have no idea what I make. Or for orphans. And so they would provide a trust to account for them. Rockefeller took this ancient legal system and applied it to corporations, that a corporation could hold the assets of another business as long as they were managing it in the best interest of that business. He could do that because way back in 1800, the federal Supreme Court ruled in the famous Dartmouth case that a corporation has the rights of an individual. Corporations are people too. That's actually true, according to the American legal system, thanks to the Dartmouth case of 1800. So he said, hey, my business is effectively a person. I can take possession of the assets and debts of these other businesses and hold them in trust and thereby control them. So he was able to find this loophole around anti-monopoly legislation by saying it's not a monopoly, it's a trust. These are independent companies that I'm managing for them in their best interest. Right? So it was a loophole. Everybody knew it was a loophole. Everybody hated him for it. Rockefeller famously slept with a gun under his pillow because he fully expected someone to kill him. There were lots of people who wanted to kill him. because he went around and used aggressive tactics to take over other people's businesses via something known as a rebate. We won't get into that. Ida B. Wells is a famous writer, wrote an expose on Rockefeller's trust system that was hugely popular, and lots of people were calling for Rockefeller's head because they saw it as anti-American, because he was eliminating those opportunities for upward mobility. There was something anti-American, un-American about being that rich, that powerful. There was something un-American about it. Why? Because it went against the commonwealth, right? So this goes back to this concept of the republic, which is actually what I want to focus on. Oh, I forgot about this guy too. J.P. Morgan. We talk a lot about financial capitalism, the advent of financial capitalism, and where people are making money not over production, but over the speculation of other people's production. You could hate Rockefeller or Carnegie, but at least they made something, right? At the very least, they were producing something. This guy didn't produce a thing in his entire life. He just made money off of other people's production. He was a financer, brilliant financer. Developed all new cost accounting systems, investment accounting systems, a way to, I'll tell you, all right, I wasn't gonna talk about this is a good one. J.P. Morgan, he was the son of a wealthy British banker. And, if you wanted to invest in someone's company, you had to find out, like, is this a good company to invest in? Like, should I give this person my $100, my $1,000, my $10,000, my $100,000 to speculate on this textile mill? Everybody knew the American economy was exploding and there was money to be made everywhere, but it was also highly volatile. There was money to be lost everywhere too. Great Britain had already been through Industrial Revolution. There was a lot of rich people in Britain that knew how this game was going to end. They've already done it. They want to get in on the ground floor and they want to invest in American industrialization because they know they're going to make a lot of money. A very large percentage of the economic growth that happens in the United States in the post-Civil War was funded by Great Britain or by British speculators. But they didn't know, like, who are these people? Who are these Americans? This guy named Carnegie, Rockefeller, are they any good? Are they lunatics? The oil industry is a great example. They're boom busting all the time, so they don't know who to invest in. Before this guy came along, if they wanted to decide on who to invest in, they would go to something called the Dunn Reports, D-U-N-N. The Dunn Reports was, you can go to Harvard Business School and look at them now. I did for my PhD dissertation. I spent 2 weeks looking at investment advice for the American fishing industry in the 19th century. You go to the Dunn Report before 1870s-ish, you open it up to see Brian Payne. Like, is this a good person to invest in? And next to the name it would say, good guy, married, 2 kids, goes to church on a regular basis, not divorced, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. Some other person would be like, divorced 4 times, has a woman on the side, you see him in the bars left and right, don't want to invest in him. J.P. Morgan said, that's stupid. So he's a womanizer, but he's really smart, businessman. So he created a new mechanisms to evaluate the potential growth of any one company. You watch these E-Trade commercials with all the graphs and bars, different colors. That's basically him. He comes up with this portfolio, and he charges a small fee to utilize it and made millions of dollars. Yeah.
Back in the 80s, when I was selling, to evaluate a customer, we'd look at the Dun and Bradstreet report.
Yeah.
And what their rating was.
Yeah.
And that's how we determined whether we wanted to do business with them.
So Dunn was two brothers from Boston in 1760 or something like that. They started this. So
I used to work there in the 70s.
Morgan?
No, Dun and Bradstreet.
Dun and yeah. So
And they had these little cards, and I was filing. And it had that, like, the name.
All their ratings.
Did it say if they were divorced or not?
Index cards.
Yeah.
And you'd file them up, like,
Yeah.
it was unbelievable. It was a good first job.
yeah.
I learned my ABCs, but I didn't.
Well, he throws all of that out and says, we're gonna do something different. All right. That's not really what I want to talk about. I want to get to the philosophical debate about wealth, because you guys are going to go visit these huge mansions, and I want to ruin it for you. So there's this, people start wondering, like, is this massive accumulation of wealth antithetical to the American Republic? That's the debate that people are starting to have in the 1877. The term Gilded Age, you may know where that term comes from? Why do we call it the Gilded Age?
Gold coated everything.
Well, who coined it? Mark Twain wrote a book called The Gilded Age. The title of the book was The Gilded Age, and it was a critique on American society because it looks flashy, but underneath is rotten to its core. So the term Gilded Age is a negative connotation. It's meant as a critique of the period, that it's just gilded. There's no substance to it. So Mark Twain wrote this book called The Gilded Age. I think it's one of his better books. It really does bring the Mark Twain cynic out. I mean, he's really, he's very critical in this book. He wasn't alone, though. And this is the debate about whether or not there's something antithetical to about wealth in the American Republic. And there emerged, let's see here, how many? 1, 2, 3, about 4. Well, this is me now. Most of what I've said, I didn't invent at all. This is sort of taking other people's works, and this is AI at work. Okay? But this is me. This is how I try to teach it to my students. That there are basically 4 competing philosophical debates about this potential problem about wealth, inequality, the individualism of capitalism, and the collective well-being of the republic. The first is something called social Darwinism. I'm sure you've heard of it, right? Yeah. Social Darwinism first appears as a term in 1879, but it was very rarely used. If you walked around in the 1880s and said social Darwinism, nobody knew what you were talking about. It doesn't become a popular term until 1944, when a historian named Richard Hofstadter wrote a book called Social Darwinism and in American Thought. And he meant it as a critique of the way Americans come to understand wealth. He was Hofstadter was one of the New Age, progressive, critical historians, these sort of lefty-leaning individuals who come to define American academia. He was one of the first. So he had this book called Social Darwinism and American Thought. I'll make my students read some of it. And basically, what it does is it takes Darwin's theories of evolution and apply it to human society. Just, throw all the humans into a mix. Those who survive were genetically engineered to survive. And those who die off, those who become poor, were genetically engineered to be poor. All right, it's predetermined. It's kind of like a Puritan predestination kind of thing revisited. People like Herbert Spencer he was like probably the biggest advocate of this idea during the time period. He takes his readings of Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, combines that with another philosopher named Thomas Malthus, the Malthusian thesis. Anybody? Mm-hmm. A couple people know it. Malthusian thesis basically says that humans would operate much like any other biological species, where they grow to a point in their population where their environment can no longer sustain them. Then there's some kind of famine and plague, kills off half the population. They grow again, another famine, plague, or sometimes a war. And so there's this sort of boom bust to the global human population. He combines that with Darwin and comes to this conclusion, social Darwinist conclusion, that the rich are genetically designed to be rich, the poor are genetically designed to be poor. Any aid or charity to the poor is at best a waste of money, and at worst is supporting the continuation of a subgroup of people that should probably just die off. Okay.
Wow.
You add, not me, okay? Remember Spencer. Francis Gallatin is another author of the time period. I make my students read these guys. They're pretty dense. It's hard to get through their stuff. Gallatin was much more racist in his interpretation about this and applies Darwinistic thought to racial constructs. And he was the one who really warned against racial mixing, the purity of the Anglo-Saxon race. He starts playing around with words like Nordicism, Aryanism. So he adds race to the element. But of the four, probably the most popular ideology of the Gilded Age. Then we have the Gospel of Wealth, which maybe you've heard of. Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. Vaguely ring a bell? No? Okay. Social Darwinists believe that rich people are genetically engineered to be better. Obviously, rich people like this idea. Right? Andrew Carnegie, rich person, he didn't like the idea. Anybody know why Andrew Carnegie might not like the idea that the rich
They came
people...
from nothing.
That's right. Well, that's a bit overblown. That's what he liked to tell people. But it's true. He was of modester means. He was orphaned, not really, but he likes to play it up a little bit. But yeah, he was of less means. He started out as a clerk. He was a very bright guy. And so he did not really like this social Darwinist theory. He writes an article, one of the most influential articles probably written in economic philosophy in American history. It's not that long. You could read it in probably 20 minutes. Easily found, 1898 is published in the North American Review, simply titled Wealth. And it becomes known as the Gospel of Wealth. Two main arguments to Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. First, wealth should not be inherited. No person should ever inherit wealth, because inheriting wealth makes somebody lazy. And that, quite opposite to what the social Darwinists felt, it is not progressive. It makes you lazy and unproductive. Therefore, number two, all wealth needs to be spent within one's own lifetime. Okay? How so, though, becomes the question. Right? So Andrew Carnegie, the gospel part of this, so Andrew Carnegie wrestled with this conflict between the commonwealth and the individualism of capitalism. Commonwealth of the collective, individual of capitalism. He said everybody who makes it good in the American capitalist system needs to spend that wealth on the collective well-being. That's how we reconcile the collectivism of a republic and the individual of capitalism. You made it big, you now have to spend that money on the betterment of society. Give it away. Charity. It's not unheard of that Bill Gates famously wrote Wealth 2. I think maybe, I'm totally lost when time exists. It was before COVID. That's all we have to say anymore. But sometime in the early 2000s, he wrote an article called Wealth. I think it was in Time magazine, which sort of reiterated this. So Bill Gates is very much a follower of the Gospel of Wealth. But there's a catch to it. Carnegie also did not believe in taxes. He didn't think the government should tax anybody, especially inheritance taxes. And he didn't believe that the government should be funding what we might call social welfare programs. Not because he didn't want to help the poor, but because he felt the government was not very good at that. He believed that the wealth had demonstrated their superiority in being able to identify a good cause by their success in government. The wealthy should be entrusted with the collective well-being. So it's not all that different to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and those wealthy people of the early republic. That, the fact that I succeeded and became this multi-billionaire proves that I know what I'm doing. And I can assess a good cause from a bad cause. And so I will invest in the good cause to promote the collective well-being. The government is incompetent. Just stay out of the way.
Is that where the library concept came from?
So what would be a good cause? Carnegie opposed charity. he never spent his money on like things like soup kitchens or home heating fuel assistance or homeless shelters. What do we associate Carnegie with? Carnegie libraries. He believed that the good cause was to invest in those places where people could promote self-improvement. So he invested in education, the arts, the library. So his vision was all these poor people would go to the library, read books, educate themselves, and go make their life better. One small problem. The average American worker worked 12 hours a day for 6 days a week, including his own workers.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of time to go searching the stacks, right? In fact, his workers at the Carnegie Mills worked 12 hours shifts, 6 days a week. Now think about it. Oh, I wasn't going to say this. No, what the hell? 12. If you're working 12-hour days, you're either on a night shift or you're on a day shift, right? Well, that sucked if you're on a night shift. So at some point, those shifts have to switch, right? You have to go from the day shift to the night shift to make it fair for everybody. So what do? Do you shut down the factory for 12 hours so that they can switch? No, you make one group work 24 hours.
Oh my God.
That's the truth.
Oh.
He had a 24-hour shift, I think every 3 months or something.
Oh my Lord.
So he's like, hey, poor people, go to the library and read after you work 80 hours, you know. I mean, sounds good on paper, but when you work it out, it's like, maybe not. All right, so that's the Gospel of Wealth. I make my students read it. It's super short. It's super interesting. It's very digestible, unlike Herbert Spencer, which you have no idea what he's talking about half the time. The third group is my favorite group. They're called the social gospelers. And mainly ministers, Presbyterian ministers for the most part. People like Washington Gladden. Walter Rosenbach is one of my favorite writers of all time, although he's super dense. He's really hard to get through. But this is probably the least popular, by the way. Like nobody was listening to these guys, not at first. The social gospelers dismissed. So on one hand, Carnegie sort of created this undeserving poor and deserving poor. The deserving poor were ones who demonstrated the capacity to learn. And if they went to the library and checked out books and read, then they could go on and go forth. If they chose not to, then be poor the rest of your life, I don't care. Right? The social Darwinists said, you're just poor, leave me alone. The Gospel of Wealth had this bold idea that poverty wasn't an individual's fault. The poverty was the result of social constructs that led someone to being poor. Racism, sexism, nativism, lack of educational systems. There were social structures that the individual could not liberate themselves. No matter how many books you read, if you were a black woman in South Carolina and you were poor, doesn't matter how smart you are, right? No matter how many books you check out of the library, you're not getting upper mobility. So the social gospelers believed in the structural elements of poverty. They were largely ministers. Most of them had experience working with the poor via charitable organizations. We call them social gospelers because they used the Bible and Christianity as their main tool, and they really emphasized Jesus Christ as this missionary. They created an image of Jesus Christ as an evangelical missionary that went out to try to help the least fortunate in society. So they use a lot of Bible references in their writings. Horribly unpopular. Nobody paid any attention to them, although I will say on a sidebar, Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, both adamant social gospelers. And we start to see this materialized with the New Deal. We start to, especially Eleanor Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was a dud. Eleanor Roosevelt was the real brains behind that operation. Okay? I could come back some other time and talk all about Eleanor Roosevelt. The fourth category I created myself. All of these exist in historical literature. Is something I call Christian missionaries. And this was one of the more popular ways. They sort of dismissed the social structures of poverty. They sort of dismissed all the philosophical debates. They have a very simplistic response to poverty, but an important one. They really dealt with the symptoms of poverty. So these were the folks that were out there, soup kitchens, homeless shelters, not really addressing what is causing poverty. They don't ever write about that. There's no philosophical concept here. They're just dealing with the symptom. Not that that's a bad thing, but they're really just handing out food to keep people alive, right? And we see a lot of church groups doing this. We still do, honestly. I do it all the time, right? We go to we make sandwiches for L Street Mission. We collect mittens and gloves every winter for the poor. This kind of stuff. This is very pronounced. They really dealt with the symptoms of poverty, and the only real solutions they offered to the poor was like, read the Bible and you won't be poor. They really hand out religious tracts and say, pray more. These folks were really big in the temperance movement, prohibition, and they really saw alcoholism as being a cause of poverty, whereas today we recognize, most social reform recognize the other way around. Poverty causes alcoholism. But for them, like prostitution, alcoholism, divorce, spousal abuse, these were causes of poverty. And if you just read the Bible, you won't drink so much, and you won't be poor. And so that's their push. Okay? Got any questions? Yeah, how many people have I offended so far?
Salvation Army.
Yes, exactly. Which was founded in like the mid-late 19th century. So yeah. All right, there is a possible fifth category here that I want to talk about, and that's government regulation. All right, skip this, skip that. So we're talking about, people are debating about whether or not there's this antithetical relationship between the republic as a collective and the individual democracy. I make my students read like Wealth and Commonwealth by Henry Lloyd. I make them read all these, and we have these big debates about, now that you've read all these primary sources, like who's right, who's wrong. Is poverty antithetical to the American Republic? Is wealth antithetical to the American Republic? Lloyd's Wealth and Commonwealth is probably the best one to read to get at the debates, because he cites all these other people. He constructs this argument about whether or not the title is Wealth Against Commonwealth, I think, or Wealth and Commonwealth, I can't remember exactly what it was. But he really pits wealth and Commonwealth against one another. The individual wealth accumulation of capitalism is antithetical to the Commonwealth of the Republic. So he best captures this argument. I'm not saying he's right, he best captures this argument. So people are starting to wonder, well, how do we address this, right? Carnegie is saying, easy, just let rich people give their money away. I mean, how many are doing that? Not many. So some people start asking the question, is it the government's responsibility to regulate the economy to create opportunity? Not equality, but opportunity. Is it the government's responsibility to regulate the economy to create opportunity? If someone fails, someone given the opportunity and still is poor, there's nothing we can do about it. We're not looking to create equality, they're looking to create opportunity. If you want to read one person to get at the heart of this debate, it's Abraham Lincoln. The foundation of the Republican Party, specifically under Abraham Lincoln, is based on the concept of opportunity for white men. Opportunity, especially not Native Americans, because the opportunity is kind of rooted in us going out there to kill the Native Americans and get the land, become farmers, but anyways. So this starts to gain traction in the Gilded Age. Like, what can the government do to create opportunities? And there's two big sections that they do this on. Railroad regulation and trust regulation to try to create opportunities. Railroad regulation starts right here in Massachusetts in 1869 with the creation of the Massachusetts Board of Railroad Commission, mainly to study safety, but they start to veer off into these ideas of creating regulation to create opportunities for other railroad companies to flourish. But the big one is the trust regulation. They try to take a shot at Rockefeller's trust structure by passing the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 to make this form of legal structure illegal, where this idea that one company can control the interest of another company illegal, thereby creating opportunity for small business. Everything about government regulation was designed to create opportunity for small business. Didn't work. Not because in theory it wouldn't work, but because it wasn't enforced. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890 and basically never used. There's a big, great merger wave in the 1890s immediately after the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed in the 1890s. In the 10 years after its passage, we had the greatest consolidation of trusts.
Oh dear.
Completely ineffective because it wasn't, the presidents of the United States chose not to enforce it. Okay? Why not? And I'll close with this. Here's the big debate. Why not? Why were they not, given all this philosophical debate about opportunity and wealth and consolidation of power, why would they not enforce this law that could have broken down corporations and created opportunities for small American businesses to flourish? Because under big concentrations of corporations, we have stability. We can eliminate they believe they could eliminate the boom-bust cycle of unnecessary competition between small operators. Unnecessary competition leads to too much speculation, too much unregulated growth, which leads to booms, which inevitably leads to busts, which creates economic instability. And you could teach a whole history course by just looking at booms and busts. What big corporations do is they create stability. If everything is controlled by 5 people, there's no boom bust. And by the 1890s, people are getting tired of recession, depression, and they decide to embrace the concepts of big corporations. Corporations are actually good for America because they create stability. Not me. This is what they're saying. So the question remains, and it remains unanswered, whether or not wealth is antithetical to the American Commonwealth. That's still a debate I don't think we've answered. So that's it.
Okay.
That's 4 weeks of class.
So when the income tax was finally instituted, what was the rate? And was it across the board or after a certain income level?
You mean the federal income tax or the state income tax?
Tell us both.
Well, there's 50 different stories to the state one. So I'll just stick with the federal one.
Who was first?
States, almost always. The de facto was a flat tax, as we have in Massachusetts. So the rates are all over the place. Income tax was horribly unpopular. The federal income tax doesn't come around until the passage of a constitutional amendment that allows it, which I think is the 18th Amendment, I want to guess. It's one of the progressive amendments of the Woodrow Wilson type era, the post-1900. The federal Congress passes a law to create a graduated income tax, which means you have the different rates. You make more money, you pay a higher percentage of your tax. That was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. That decision by the Supreme Court was so horribly unpopular that the American people passed a constitutional amendment that gives the federal government the right to have a graduated income tax. And I want to say it's 1900-ish time.
So I had a question. You talked about the Great Merger and the country deciding that we're going to go with that stability. There had been, the boom in the bottom. And I think in the late 1800s, there might have been a depression of some sort of recession.
But that caused the merger wave.
But if they had enforced it, would the Great Depression of the 1920s maybe have not happened?
Probably not. I mean, it would have happened. Yes, I think it would have happened.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Great Depression is a whole nother story. Well, it's not a whole nother story, but my opinion of it is the result of overproduction. We produced way more stuff than we could possibly consume. So it had more to do with the transition to a consumer economy. And because of that, we have a deflation, which leads to periodic layoffs. So this is actually where I really focus my research on. So I could go for another 12 hours on this one after I took the class. But American workers were very used to working seasonal occupations throughout the 19th and early 20th century. It was very common to work for 3 months and then be laid off for 2 months. To work for another 2 months and then be laid off for a month. And work for a couple weeks and then be laid off. And it was very seasonal, depending on what your occupation was. A lot of work in the summer, very little work in the winter. So American workers had gotten used to putting money aside, putting into their savings accounts. So that I would work 70 hours a week while I could, save money, lose my job, live off that money, and then when the season came around, I'd work again. Great Depression started out like any other recession, really no big deal. Everybody loses their job, no problem. I'll go to my bank and pull out my money and live. What is different about the Great Depression is that the industrial recession corresponds with the financial crisis at the same time. And all those banks close and everybody loses their money. It just evaporates. This is before FDIC. Would ensure your FDIC comes as a result of the Great Depression. So people lost their job. Oh, I lost my job at the meatpacking plant. I'll get a job in three weeks, or I'll get a job in 2 months, no problem. I'll go down to the bank, get my $500 out. There's a big close sign on the bank. Now you go from being not economically secure to being destitute.
When did the bell system come into place? In the 1890s?
The bell system?
Ma Bell, like the telephone company.
Oh yeah, Alexander Graham Bell.
Yeah.
Yeah, so-
Was that 1890s?
Yeah, I would have, where's my invention? Here it is. He falls under this category. One of the main drivers to the economic boom of the 1890s was the creation of new inventions. So I have my students read Edison, Bell, but what I would love to say about this is that U.S. Patent Office recorded 276 inventions in the 1790s and 234,954 in the 1890s, right?
Wow.
But all of these inventions here, name a famous inventor from the 1790s. Name one. There's only one.
Eli Whitney, the cotton gin?
Okay, no, there's two. Wore glasses, lived in Philadelphia.
Oh,
Ben
Franklin.
Franklin,
Franklin,
right?
yeah.
He invented things that were for the common good.
Right.
Stove, the lightning rod, glasses. Who are the famous inventors of the 1890s? Thomas Edison, right? He invented things to make money. So the inventors of the 1790s didn't patent their inventions. Like, yeah, you want bifocals? Go make bifocals. This is great. I invented this for you. Go do it. You want a lightning rod? Don't have to pay me. Go put a lightning rod in the ground. The inventors of the 1890s, Bell, Edison. Bell was a little different. He's a crossover. Because why did Bell invent the telephone?
Because of
Deaf
hearing
people.
problems.
Right. So he started out with this idea like, hey, I want to make life better for deaf people. You're not going to make money on this? Right. So he immediately incorporated it, patented it, sold it. Right. And so inventions in the 1890s were about making money. Again, it's that shift from commonwealth to individual wealth.
And then they broke it up in the 1980s.
Yeah, that was part of the another resurgence of antitrust litigation. They wanted to German antitrust wasn't around anymore, had been replaced, but there was antitrust legislation.
What's your opinion of the History Channel's Men Who Built America?
I don't think I've seen it.
Really? Oh, wow.
I try not to watch the History Channel.
Okay.
There's too many ice road truckers on the History Channel.
No, you gotta get the right series.
I don't know it.
They go over
Is
like,
it-
in
so
pretty
my-
good detail.
My question is it like a captains of industry that we celebrate? Or is it robber barons, like these are demons who want to
Little
create?
of both.
A little bit of both?
Yeah, I mean,
I like it
they
then.
play it pretty much down the middle.
Yeah,
You should look it up.
All right.
It's really interesting.
yeah.
You missed last night's, it was the history of the lollipop.
Oh.
Do you know who?
I read a great book about the history of Tupperware once.
Right.
Highly recommend. I think it's just called
It was
Tupperware.
really good.
Really good. Actually, that got turned into a PBS American Experience. You guys
Yes,
familiar with them?
Tupperware.
Those are really, I really like those.
Yeah.
American Experience ones.
Do you know how he got the name lollipop?
No.
He said it was a horse he used to put bet on all the time.
Did he win the
It's
bets?
called lollipop, right?
Yeah.
Where does the term Kodak comes from?
Kodak?
Kodak. like the camera. It was George Eastman, was the inventor of Kodak.
Right.
1890s, I worked at the George Eastman House as an intern in Rochester, New York for a little while. Where does the word Kodak come from?
So acronym? No?
Totally made it up.
Oh,
He
you
threw some
made it
letters on the page and said, that looks cool. I just called it Kodak. Totally made it up. I thought it could be catchy. Marketing, PR.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really important.
I'm going over. I didn't realize how long I was going for.
It's
My
okay.
students are normally like, class is over. Can we leave?"
We didn't give you a time
No.
constraint, so please help yourself. There's tea, because it's St. Patrick's Day, I didn't want to serve coffee on St. Patrick's Day. And there's Irish soda bread, and there's scones, and all kinds of things, so please socialize and get refreshments.
Okay,
And
thank
Brian,
you.
thank you again so
Excellent.
very much.